this episode, I'm speaking with Danny Miranda. Danny hosts his own podcast where he's interviewed people like Gary Vaynerchuk, Alex Hormozi, and even Seth Godin. We will be discussing content creation, entrepreneurship, the future of technology, and beyond. Welcome back to the podcast.
The Alfie Whattam podcast.
Hello, Danny. Thank you for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Can I just start by saying, not really a question, but I love your podcast. I DM'd you on X a couple of months ago, I think, after the Alex Hormozi episode, and then I binged you for a while. So I'm going to start by repeating what you said to Alex, basically, in that we've spent so much time together. So it's great to finally connect.
I love to hear that. And what do you think about the podcast speaks to you?
I think you clearly give a shit a lot more than the majority of people. And that inspires me to work a little bit harder as well. So I went into deep research mode for this, for example. Whereas most people, it's usually the same questions. Hey, tell me about yourself. Hey, tell me about this business. And like, they've done that exact same podcast 10 times. So why is there any motivation to do the 11th, right? You ask questions and you do your level of preparation. And I think you're really genuine. I think people like to listen to you in the same way that they like to listen to Joe Rogan because, they can tell there's no agenda, there's nothing hidden behind it. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the reflections and the truth behind it because I feel that way, but I don't always know if that's coming through. And so I appreciate you saying that.
That's definitely how you're coming across, my friend. So, you definitely got that in spades. Look, I want to start with entrepreneurship because I know you don't call yourself an entrepreneur, but I think you are because you've done many, many things since, being born, from the Little League blog to the Tuesday Treasure blog to Nick's Vision to the Sunny Times. You had that e-commerce business, didn't you, after you graduated political science at Binghamton, in the DM, that Substack, and then obviously now the podcast and of course the artofinterviewing.com where people should go. But you had many, many steps until you got to something that really exploded and is now taking off, and you found your feet with the podcast, right? Can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, entrepreneurship, and maybe you might not use that word, but those lessons that you've kind of learned along and those stepping stones to get to where you are today, basically?
Yeah, I think it's a very astute observation that I don't consider myself an entrepreneur, but I've done entrepreneurial things and I very much could be characterized as one. I would say that it's been a journey of figuring out myself, and I've always listened. There have been a lot of times in my life where I've listened to the call being the thing that I was put here to do and placed in this moment to do. And at one point, the call was, I'm just going to write a Little League blog because that makes the most sense. And another time, the call was, I'm going to start a podcast and interview people and talk to them in a way that inspires me and that I would want them to be interviewed. And so there have been times when I haven't followed that call as well. And sometimes that call leads to money and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes you can't connect the dots until you look backwards. But none of those projects have really started, or the far majority haven't started because I wanted to make money. They've started because something inside of me said, this needs to exist in the world. And then if I do it for 3 years, like the podcast has been going on now for 3 years, that's when the recognition starts, or some people start saying, wow, this is pretty cool. Wow, I got to go check out, you did this 377 more times. Like, I got to understand this at a deeper level. Like, why is this person so interested in doing this? So I think that's kind of where my entrepreneurial journey has come from and what it's taught me.
The consistency of your podcast is obviously very impressive. We both started in 2020. I think I started in June or July. You started in September or something, right? You started by doing mini phone calls with people on X, and I started in a very, very similar way. I was speaking to my clients, and it was lockdown. We couldn't do these live events that I used to throw and these parties, so we started to put them on Zoom instead. But tell us a little bit about, I guess, the progression, really, because when you started, it was just you on audio, right? And now you've got, episodes in studios. You've got a great editor and team that put together the clips and everything. That wouldn't have happened if you didn't start on a webcam doing audio, right? So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, I think that when we start things, we compare ourselves to people who have already done all the things. And we're like, how can I compete with this person if I don't have a studio, if I don't have the right microphone, if I don't have the right equipment? And I think it's all nonsense. And I think what you really have to understand is that where the thing goes is going to be different than what it is when it starts.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. And that's something that you have to accept and embrace and love. I like to think about it. It's like loving the part of the journey you are at. If you can do that, if you can really sit with the part of the journey you're at and love that part of the journey, it will eventually build and build and build into something greater if that is your intention. So I think that's been a huge unlock for me and a huge realization. And I knew from the start of doing the podcast, this is something that I enjoy doing for the sake of doing it. And because I enjoy doing it for the sake of doing it, I'm going to want to continue doing it in better and better ways.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the progression.
Well, you mentioned there about enjoying that stage of the journey, and that relates very much to the first ever post that you put on Instagram, okay? Because I'm not sure if you had other things that you deleted prior, but the first thing sitting on your profile is a quote, and you said, "Fall in love with whatever part of the journey you're on. If you're just starting, be grateful in the beginning. If you're in the middle, embrace the boring path. And if you're at the end, smile because you made it this far." I think you are probably, correct me if you feel differently, but you've probably gone from the starting to that middle part. And I think the big jump has been those episodes with like someone like Gary Vee or Alex Hormozy or Chris Williams, but where it's kind of, your audience has probably gone from getting more downloads in a day than you would previously get in the previous year or something like that. And I've seen that exponential growth with some episodes. I've been doing this for 3 years as well now. But have you found that to be true, in that the growth comes in, how do I put this? More can happen in a day than can happen in a decade after it all compounds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know about decade necessarily yet because I haven't been there yet, and I'm curious to see what the 11th year of the podcast looks like.
Sure.
But something like, the days that really stand out are like, it's crazy what happens, and it's crazy the feeling I get. And the feeling I get is like, wow, all of this work that I did, sticking through this when it didn't make sense, it all paid off in this one moment. And then you start to like look back and you're like, wow, if I had quit then, if I'd stopped doing this then. But what's fascinating is that, like, I'm so happy you read that quote about the beginning, middle, and end, because I still view myself in the beginning.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm 3 years into the podcast, over 400 episodes. And I'm thinking to myself, I want to do this for at least 30 years. So if I consider the first 10 years the beginning, like, where are we going to go from here? I committed to doing this podcast for 10 years to myself. And I guess I could have said, the first year of the 10 was the beginning, or the first 3 were the beginning, and now entering the 4th, it's the middle. But I view the first 10 as the beginning, because I know where this is going to go. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about it at this point where I'm 28 years young and I found the thing that lights me up and makes me feel so alive. So yeah, that's where I viewed it.
I feel you, man. I'm 27 myself, so I completely get where you're coming from. You mentioned there about what would happen in perhaps year 11. I know you've got a bit of a grand aspiration to sell out Madison Square Garden, right? And I know, Gary.
Oh yeah,
is like buying the New York Jets. It's great to have that long-term ultimate goal that you can visualize. Well, why? I heard you talk about that on podcasts, like that is the goal. But why is that the goal? I've never actually heard you explain like the reason behind that.
When I was a kid, I started this blog called Knicks Vision, and I was a huge New York Knicks basketball fan. Like that, I was crazy. I watched every game. I wrote reports on every game. I met the players by virtue of doing the blog. And at a certain point, I understood I could never be a player on this court. 19,763 people are not coming to watch me play basketball. That is not my gift. I love shooting hoops but it's not something that I'm put on this earth to do. So I always was interested, like, what am I put on this earth to do? What is the reason for being? What am I doing here? And once I had a clearer picture or clearer understanding of that, I asked myself, how can I expand the vision to the craziest place that I can imagine that's in alignment with my childhood? And that to me gets me up every morning. That to me gets me excited because it relates strongly to the nostalgia I feel about Madison Square Garden, taking the train out there. I mean, dude, it's like I have so many memories of going to Knicks and Mets games, like a baseball team. And it's like, to me, the joy of watching athletes perform in their gifts. If I develop my gifts enough as an interviewer, as a podcaster, potentially that could be the place that we can go. And so that to me is the really exciting part, and that's why that's the vision.
Hey, this podcast is brought to you by WeLoveAlpha.com. If you're looking to grow and hire and scale your software engineering team in the UK, then go to WeLoveAlpha.com to hire the best software developers on the market. Everything across Java to C# to PHP to Python to React and Angular and mobile and more. Go to WeLoveAlpha.com to hire the best software engineers in the UK now.
I mentioned Gary Vee a second ago to compare your ultimate goal with his New York Jets story, but you have an interesting story with Mr. Vaynerchuk, right? He called your mum once. Context to that, because just saying that line on itself sounds weird. Like, can you explain the story?
So I wanted to go to his book signing for his second book, The Thank You Economy. And he had really impacted me in a deep way because in 2009 or 2010, when I started my first blog, I wrote a blog post about him. I was watching his Wine Library TV show. And now my second blog, Nick's Vision, I was still following his story and I was still interested in him. But I saw it was a school night and he had a book signing. It was in New York City. I wanted to go. And my mom didn't let me go because she was like, it's a school night. What are you doing here? So I tweet to Mr. Vaynerchuk and I say, hey, Gary, I would love to go to your book signing, but I can't. It's a school night. Wish I could make it. And he sends me a message almost immediately. What's your mom's number? And then proceeds to call her on the spot. Hey, Miss Miranda, I think your son would get more value from coming to my book signing than he would doing his homework tonight. And he was absolutely right on that. And my mom, bless her heart, actually agreed. And she said, if this guy's crazy enough to call me out of the blue, then I'm willing to sacrifice my time and energy to drive Danny to the book signing. And she did. And it was a wonderful memory. I got an incredible picture with Gary Vee, which I quickly made my profile picture, the present and future of American business. And it was a very heartwarming experience of me believing I was on the right path. But also it was a moment of, wow, I have the greatest mother in the world, because she took her initial opinion and then circumstances changed and she was willing to update her opinion. And I don't know if I've ever thought about it in those terms until this moment, but that is what great parenting looks like. And that is why I'm so grateful for my mom for being the best mom ever.
Hey, it's a good lesson. I have a 7-month-old baby, my first kid, right? So it's any parenting lessons I will take, because it's a roller coaster. I think Gary's probably right. I mean, you can learn a lot more from somebody worth, hundreds of millions of dollars, as opposed to, going to some formal, old-fashioned educational institution. What are your thoughts on, I guess, university and I guess college is what you call it in the States, right? Because I didn't graduate. My wife has a PhD and she has a very different type of work. So, opposites attracts perhaps. I know that you did political science because you said it was like the easiest thing that you could think of doing. So what are your views on, I guess, formal education?
I think for some people it's amazing, but the far majority, it's listening to the call of someone else. It's listening to how someone else believes you should live your life. It's listening to the frame that they are putting you in, the box they're putting you in. And if people were really honest with themselves and they really sat with themselves, they would understand that frame isn't correct for them. Even if they like the topic of political science or psychology, what if you interviewed the people in psychology or political science that were actually interesting to you? What if I've learned more in the past 3 years by virtue of doing the podcast about entrepreneurship, about psychology, about mindfulness, about life than I have in any years of my life. And the reason for that is I'm creating my own education. Similar to how Joe Rogan discusses how he makes his own education by virtue of doing the podcast, I feel the exact same way. And when we are interested in our teachers, we then actually learn the information better. So I think the system is set up in a way that kind of represses people, that doesn't bring out their own unique gifts and puts them in a frame that is not their own, puts them in a frame of other people.
Yeah, I think education is being essentially replaced by online learning and podcasts and courses. And that's why it's so great to see you, distilling everything you've learned over the past couple of years into a comprehensive guide for people that want to interview, whether you're a podcaster or a journalist or whatever, really. Just tell us a little bit about the artofinterviewing.com.
Yeah, so artofinterviewing.com is about how do I take all the lessons and learnings I've spent 3,000 hours trying to understand human beings and trying to understand how do interviews work and how do podcasts work and what makes for the best podcasts and conversations and how do people ask questions and which are the best questions and how do we get the most out of everything? And what I've realized in this study is this is not about interviewing. This is not about podcasting. This is about speaking to people. This is about connecting with people. This is about learning from people around you and making the most out of every moment. Because think about this. If you ask, how is your day doing? Well, that's a different question than what are the three greatest things that happened to you this week? Right? You're going to get a completely different response just based on that one simple tweak. It's the same question, but framed differently, you're going to get a different answer. And to me, that's so exciting because you're opening up the scope of what's possible in your day-to-day interactions. You're opening up reality for the other person and for yourself. And questions are so powerful and they're at the heart of everything that happens in your own life and in other people's lives. So because of that, I said to myself, I've learned a lot by virtue of doing 400 plus interviews. Why don't I just put this all into a resource to help people live better lives?
One thing that you do which is pretty interesting when it comes to questions is, I think very similar to Tim Ferriss, is that you have a couple of almost go-to questions which can really unlock like brilliant answers in people. There's one that you use a lot to end your podcasts. I think you know what I'm gonna say, but like, what's a challenge that you can leave the audience with? I was going to mention it at the end of this episode, but you talk about questions there, so a great time if ever. But what for the viewers listening now, what challenge would you leave them with?
I would leave them with loving someone. Like, if we spread love, that is really what we're doing. That's what I'm doing when I'm interviewing people at the highest form, is I'm trying to love that person. I'm trying to really become one with that person in that moment so that we can get something out of it. And even if you don't interview people, it's like, how do you instill a little bit of love? I mean, I was interviewed on someone's podcast yesterday, and they were just like, hey, at the end of it, they were like, hey, what's your address? I want to send you this quote book. And I was like so touched by that because in that moment, they were loving me. They were saying, you've impacted my life in a deep way, and I want to appreciate you for that. And so I think my challenge to people is just love more.
Yeah, I mean, when you have love in your heart, it's really hard not to feel envy or greed. They don't exist in the same world, I think one thing that you did really well when it comes to, loving people is you gotta love yourself really at the end of the day. And I saw that you like to write down like, I love myself as an affirmation, and just do it over and over and over again because it's conditioning your mind to think in the right way.
I did that in multiple different parts of my journey. I don't currently do it, but I feel very much like I do love myself. And the parts of the journey where I've done it, it has been so transformational and served as a baseline and a level set for it's really crazy because you'll do something silly, and then all of a sudden the first thought in your head will be, I love myself.
Yeah.
It's like that changes your perception of reality in an incredible way if you're actually able to do that. So I got that from the book Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It by Kamal Ravikant, which I highly recommend. Kamal has become a friend, and he is someone who wrote a book that really changed my life, and I highly recommend it. So, yeah.
Well, what I really like about doing that, Danny, is it puts you in a frame of mind where you're almost like ignoring negativity, and I think you do something really well connected to this with X in that you filter words that you don't want to see. I've never heard of this before, but I've just started doing it. Like, why do you do that? Like, what words are you blocking, and what impact has that had as a result?
I mean, I would pull it up, but I kind of don't want to give credence to the words themselves. I kind of don't want to speak the words that I don't want to see. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the words that impact me are words that are political in nature, or that I feel like are divisive, or can make me feel upset. A lot of this comes down to, like, if you consume things that make you feel upset, you are going to feel upset. So that doesn't mean ignore the world. Like, the world will still find its way to the most important issues. They'll find a way to you, even if you block all the words on Twitter. But it's just a subtle barrier I like to put in that allows me more peace. And a lot of people tell me I don't like Twitter. I don't like spending time on X. And I'm like, I understand that. And this is what I did when I felt that way. And people have been surprised. So that's a very cool tactic, and I'm happy you brought it up. And I highly recommend people check that out. And I'm going to make a note to tweet out that list right now after this is over, so that people can benefit from it.
The only downside is that you won't be able to see your own tweets.
Well, I'll do a screenshot, so I won't actually include the words.
Okay. Another thing that you do that's really beneficial for setting up a positive frame of mind is you seem to be, like myself, really interested in meditation. Have you ever checked out Tara Brach's Smile meditation?
I have not. I've heard of her name, but I've never checked it out.
Really good. I'll send you a link afterwards. It's
please,
one of the best meditations that I do weekly. It's changed my life. And then there's another one by Mr. Tony Robbins. It's priming exercise, which is, I don't know if you've heard of that one before.
The morning one, right?
Yeah, it's like 3 things.
So good.
The gratitude, and then 3 things to aim for, and sending out, like you said, love to people, even your worst enemies, because if you can visualize them being happy, it removes the hate. It's like Gandhi said that you can't like, holding on to envy is like, it's like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yeah, like holding on to a hot coal in your hand.
Yeah,
that's what anger is.
Yeah, just let go of it.
It opens up an entire new experience of reality.
Yeah,
and that's why it's so important to focus on these things, I feel like.
Why meditation for you, aside from I guess clarity of mind, de-stressing, peace? Well, what does it bring you?
The understanding that in every moment is perfect just the way it unfolds. The peace of knowing that I'm on the right path. Just the ability to run through the end of the day. Like, what I've been doing recently is 20 minutes at night, and I've just been sitting in bed, like with my back straight, and just running through the moments. They're not even intentionally running through the moments, just seeing what comes up based on what happened that day. And it's so impactful. I go to sleep so well. And so why does it work? I don't know. I think it's like we're so stimulated, and so if you remove the stimulation, you get to a new place. It impacts my life in so many subtle ways that I can't speak about it enough. Like, for instance, I was just with a friend, and we were looking at a bunch of we were on a balcony, and we were looking at a bunch of cars driving by. And I said to him, dude, like, all these people, they have their own story. They're living in their own world. And like, it's the most important thing. And every single car we see is a story, is a life that someone is like fully invested in. And he's like, oh, wow, I've just never considered that.
Yeah.
And I hadn't considered that either, really, until meditating. So I think that that's kind of what it's given me.
What are you doing specifically? Are you visualizing like a gratitude list, or are you doing a mantra, or are you following along to a guided meditation? What are you doing?
Just sitting there and seeing what comes up. There's no guidance. There's no direct intention. It's literally just for the sake of doing it, watching my mind, or just spending time with my mind.
Yeah. What's it like in Austin? Because I've never been to Texas, but it seems to be the podcasting hub of the world with with Joe and I can predict, I don't know if anyone's ever said this on a podcast, but I can predict you'll be on that show like in, 1 to 3, 4 years. I can see it happening, man. I mean, your neighbours with the guy, and you're clearly making waves in the scene. But what's it like living there? Because everyone that's interesting seems to be moving there right now.
Yeah, it's a hub of interesting, creative, incredible people, which I feel blessed to be able to spend some time with. And I read this book, Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be, by Stephen Pressfield. And for me, was just like, oh my God, if a book ever hit me, it hit me. And I think I read it like right after moving to Austin. And so it was great confirmation bias. But it was it's an incredible look at like, okay, you want to be a writer, put your ass behind a keyboard and actually write. You want to be a podcaster, actually record podcasts. But then the further part of that is like, put yourself in the macro environment that people love podcasting. And so that Austin, Texas right now is the place where podcasting seems to be sprouting up. Of course, Rogan is a huge reason why, Tim Ferriss another. But yeah, I think it's a special place. It's a special time. I see so much energy and wisdom moving here. I've never experienced anything like it. Everyone who moves here says the same thing, like, oh my God, the people here are incredible. And if I want to be an incredible person, I got to put myself in the room with incredible people. So that's what Austin is for me right now.
I do have some friends over there. I interviewed somebody on my podcast recently called Peter Wang, who is a very, very smart guy living in Austin. Maybe you should see if you can connect with him. But he is the founder of a company which is like the world's largest data visualization platform. He's one of the leaders with a technology called Python, which is used in the software engineering world and in my space quite a lot. And super fascinating guy who did a really interesting interview on Lex's podcast, on Lex Friedman, and was grateful enough to I was grateful enough for him to spend time on mine to talk to me about some of these ideas. But he said that Austin seems to be like where it's all happening from like the renaissance of the world right now. Like, we have these times in history, whether it's Silicon Valley in like the 2000s, or London, right? Back in the olden days when we ruled the world. It almost seems like Austin is becoming that cultural epicenter of the world.
I feel that. And I don't know if it's confirmation bias, but it's cool to hear you reflect that as well. And I mean, I've never been somewhere where I will randomly run into someone and then I'll spend an hour talking to them, like a deep conversation, and then it'll happen again. And it'll be another deep conversation with someone. Just what is happening? Is this a function of my own podcast getting more, being seen more? Is this a function of Austin? Like, I'm trying to parse through this and understand it, but I find that I'm so blessed to live here. I'm so blessed to spend time here. And everyone knows that this is like a really special place and time right now.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, mate, for taking the time. Like I said, I've listened to many, many, many hours of you. So speaking to you is definitely a great feeling. So thank you for everything that you're doing. And thank you for continuing to set a high bar within the podcasting world. I love it, but hate it at the same time because I got many jobs to do, man. Like, you're making my life hard. But thank you for doing that.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, and I often hope that no one tries to compare themselves to me in any way, because there's no expectation for anyone to do a certain amount of research. There's no expectation for anyone to do a certain amount of episodes. I do it because I love it, and this brings me joy, and I hope other people do what brings them joy, which might not be as one-track minded as simply doing a podcast nonstop. But thank you so much for the thoughtful questions and your energy. I really appreciate you, man, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, mate.
Hey, thanks for watching this podcast. Make sure that you like, subscribe, follow, comment, etc., etc., and I'll see you in the next episode.